Gene Simmons looked at Ace Frehley across the cramped rehearsal space and said something that would haunt their relationship for the next 40 years. "You can play guitar, Paul. Nobody's questioning that. But you're not rock star material. You don't have the presence, the charisma. You're a sideman, not a frontman." Ace, who'd only been in the band for 3 weeks, said nothing, just nodded, put his head down, and kept playing. But inside, something shifted. A determination settled into place that would eventually prove Gene Simmons spectacularly, publicly, commercially wrong. Because 6 years later, Ace Frehley's solo album would outsell Gene's by a margin so wide it would force Gene to reconsider everything he thought he knew about what made a rock star. It was November 1973 in a freezing rehearsal loft in Manhattan. The kind of space that wasn't meant for humans to spend 8 hours a day in, with concrete floors, no insulation, and a single space heater that barely made a difference. Kiss was barely a band, more like a concept with instruments. 4 guys who'd only been playing together for months, still figuring out if this thing would work, if their wildly ambitious vision had any chance of becoming reality. Gene and Paul had the vision, the business plan, the theatrical ambitions that seemed insane to everyone who heard them. They weren't just going to be a rock band, they were going to be a phenomenon, a brand, a cultural force. They'd found Peter Criss through an ad in the Village Voice, and the drumming was solid, the personality was big enough to work within their concept. But lead guitar had been a problem, a persistent frustration. They'd gone through several players before Ace walked through the door that April, each one lacking something essential that Gene and Paul couldn't quite define until they met the person who didn't have it. And while Ace could play, really play, in ways that made even Gene stop and listen, Gene had serious doubts about whether this quiet kid from the Bronx had what it took to be part of what Gene envisioned Kiss becoming. Ace barely spoke in rehearsals. He'd arrive exactly on time, never early, set up his equipment with methodical precision, then stand in his corner of the room waiting for direction. When they played, Ace's eyes stayed fixed on his guitar, rarely looking up, never making eye contact with the others. Between songs, while Gene and Paul debated arrangements and Peter cracked jokes, Ace would just stand there, silent, tuning his guitar even though it was already in tune. Gene Simmons didn't just want a band. He wanted an empire. He'd grown up poor, an immigrant kid who'd learned early that success in America required more than talent. It required salesmanship, showmanship, the ability to command attention and keep it. Gene had studied the most successful bands, analyzed what made them work, what made them sell, and one thing was clear. Rock stars needed presence. They needed to own the stage, dominate the room, make people unable to look away. Paul Stanley had that presence. Even in rehearsal, even in street clothes without makeup or costume, Paul commanded attention. When Paul played, he moved, he performed, he sold every note. Gene himself had that quality, that natural charisma that made people pay attention when he spoke. Peter had it in his own way, a manic energy behind the drums that was impossible to ignore. But Ace was different. Ace was quiet, almost withdrawn. He'd show up to rehearsal, plug in, play brilliantly, then unplug and disappear. He didn't talk much, didn't joke around, didn't seem interested in the social dynamics of being in a band. And that worried Gene, because Gene knew something that Ace didn't seem to understand yet. In the music business, being able to play your instrument was the bare minimum. Lots of guys could play. The rehearsal studios and bar bands of New York were full of technically proficient musicians who'd never make it beyond wedding gigs and session work. What separated the stars from the sidemen was something else entirely. It was personality, presence, the indefinable quality that made people want to watch you, want to be you, want to buy whatever you were selling. That November afternoon, after a particularly frustrating rehearsal where Ace had played perfectly, but with all the stage presence of a piece of furniture, Gene pulled him aside. They were alone in the loft, the others having left to grab food. Gene sat on an amplifier, gestured for Ace to sit. Ace remained standing, guitar still strapped on, waiting. "We need to talk about your performance," Gene said. "I thought I played it right," Ace replied, his Bronx accent thick. "You did. Musically, you're perfect. But that's not enough. Kiss isn't going to be just another bar band. We're going to be theatrical, visual, and experience. And that requires performers, not just musicians. Ace looked at him, expression neutral. I perform. You play guitar, that's not the same thing. When you're on stage, you stand there like a statue. You don't move, don't engage with the audience, don't project any personality. You're technically excellent, but you're not a rock star. The words hung in the cold air of the rehearsal space. Ace's grip on his guitar neck tightened slightly, the only visible reaction. What do you want me to do? I don't know if there's anything you can do, Gene said, and there was something almost apologetic in his voice. Presence isn't something you can learn. Either you have it or you don't, and I'm worried that you don't. Ace was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You want to replace me? No, your playing is too good, but I need you to understand something. You're the lead guitarist in this band, but you're not a star. Paul and I, we're the stars, your support, and there's nothing wrong with that. Every band needs solid support players. Just don't expect to be in the spotlight. Ace unplugged his guitar, started packing it into its case. Got it, he said quietly. Then he left, walking down 4 flights of stairs and out into the Manhattan cold, carrying equipment that weighed almost as much as the words Gene had just dropped on him. What Gene didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Ace Frehley had been hearing variations of that speech his entire life. Teachers who said he'd never amount to anything, guidance counselors who suggested trade school instead of music, family members who thought guitar was a hobby, not a career. Bandmates in previous groups who'd pushed him to the background, used his playing but kept him out of the spotlight. Ace was used to being underestimated, used to being told he wasn't enough, and he developed a defense mechanism, proved them wrong through action, not words. The next rehearsal, Ace showed up early. He'd been thinking about what Gene said, and while the words stung, there was truth in them. He didn't move on stage. He didn't have the natural showmanship of Paul or the commanding presence of Gene. But maybe that was because he'd been too focused on getting the notes right, too worried about musical perfection to think about anything else. Maybe it was time to try something different. When the full band started playing that day, Ace did something he'd never done before. He moved. Not a lot, not dramatically, just started swaying to the rhythm, taking a few steps during his solos, lifting his guitar toward the ceiling on the high notes. It felt awkward, self-conscious, completely unnatural. But he pushed through the discomfort. Gene noticed immediately. Didn't say anything during rehearsal, but afterward, he nodded at Ace. Better? Keep working on it. It wasn't praise, barely even encouragement, but it was acknowledgement. And for Ace, that was enough to keep trying. Over the next months, as Kiss developed their stage show, Ace continued to evolve. The makeup concept emerged, and Ace became the Space Ace, the silver-faced guitarist from another planet. The character gave him something to hide behind, a persona he could inhabit that wasn't quite himself. As Space Ace, he could do things that Ace Frehley from the Bronx would never do. He could strike poses, interact with the crowd, become larger than life. He watched Paul, studied how he commanded attention. He observed Gene's calculated movements. And slowly, awkwardly at first, but with growing confidence, Ace developed his own approach. The smoking guitar became his breakthrough. When it finally worked during a show in early 1976, the crowd's reaction was instant and massive. And Ace, triggering the smoke effect while playing a solo, became in that moment exactly what Gene had said he could never be, a rock star. But Gene's words stayed with him. Your support, not a star. And as Kiss started playing bigger venues, as their following grew, Ace noticed the dynamic. Gene and Paul handled interviews. Gene and Paul made business decisions. Gene and Paul were the faces of Kiss in the press. Ace and Peter were the musicians, important but secondary. And while Ace told himself he was okay with that arrangement, part of him wondered if Gene was right. Maybe he wasn't rock star material. Maybe he was destined to always be in someone else's shadow. By 1976, Kiss was massive. Stadium tours, platinum albums, merchandise everywhere. The biggest band in America, arguably the world. And Ace had become an incredible stage performer. The shy kid who used to stand frozen during solos had transformed into Space Ace, a guitar-wielding alien who commanded his section of the stage with confidence and charisma. His signature smoking guitar became one of the most iconic images in rock. His solos were highlights of every show. Fans screamed for him specifically, bought merchandise with his face on it, related to the Space Ace character in ways that surprised everyone. But in the internal dynamics of Kiss, the hierarchy remained. Gene and Paul were the leaders. Ace and Peter were the band members. And Gene continued to make that distinction clear in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. When reporters asked questions, Gene would answer even if the question was directed at Ace. When business decisions needed to be made, Gene and Paul would decide, then inform Ace and Peter. The message was consistent. You're valuable, you're important, but you're not equal. Then came 1978, and everything changed. The decision was made for all four members to release solo albums simultaneously. It was a marketing gimmick, a way to saturate the market with Kiss product and prove the band's commercial power. Each album would have the full weight of the Kiss promotional machine behind it. Each album would be equally pushed, and the results would show, definitively, which members of Kiss the public really cared about. Gene was confident his album would dominate. He'd recruited expensive session musicians, worked with top producers, created what he thought was a commercially perfect product. His face was the most recognizable in Kiss, his persona the most marketable. The demon, breathing fire and spitting blood, that's what people associated with Kiss. His album would prove that he was the real star, the indispensable member. Ace approached his solo album completely differently. No expensive session players flown in from Los Angeles, no overproduction with layers upon layers of studio tricks. Just Ace and some friends he'd known for years, guys from the New York scene who understood his musical sensibility, playing the music Ace had always wanted to play but never could within Kiss's theatrical framework. Straightforward rock with melody and heart, guitar work that showcased his technique without being showy about it, songs that came from genuine creative impulse rather than commercial calculation or committee decision. He recorded most of it in a small studio in New York, working late nights when the rates were cheaper, when the pressure was off, when he could just focus on the music without worrying about what Gene or Paul might think, without trying to fit into anyone's expectations. He covered New York Groove, a song by the British band Hello that most Americans had never heard because it felt right, because it matched his energy, because he connected with it on a gut level that had nothing to do with market research or radio potential. He poured himself into every track, not trying to be Space Ace or live up to any image or prove anything to anyone. Just being Paul Frehley from the Bronx who loved playing guitar and finally had the freedom to play exactly what he wanted. The process was liberating in ways Ace hadn't expected. In Kiss, every creative decision went through Gene and Paul. Every song arrangement, every solo, every musical choice was subject to their approval and often their revision. But on his solo album, Ace made every decision himself. If something felt right, he kept it. If it didn't serve the song, he cut it. For the first time in his professional career, he was making music on his own terms. When the albums released in September 1978, the results shocked everyone. Ace's album didn't just sell well, it outsold the other three by a significant margin. New York Groove became a hit single, climbing the charts, getting radio play that the other members' singles didn't receive. Critics who'd spent years dismissing Kiss as a gimmick suddenly discovered that when you stripped away the makeup and spectacle, Ace Frehley could actually write and play music that connected with people on a purely musical level. The commercial numbers were undeniable. Ace's album eventually went platinum. Gene's album sold respectably, but nowhere near Ace's numbers. And in the internal dynamics of Kiss, something fundamental shifted. Because the market had spoken, and the market had said that Ace Frehley, the guy Gene had dismissed as support rather than star, was actually the member people most wanted to hear from. Gene's reaction to this news was complex. Publicly, he congratulated Ace, said supportive things in interviews about how proud he was of Ace's success. But privately, the results gnawed at him. Gene had built his entire identity around being the smartest guy in the room, the one who understood the business, the one who knew what would sell. And He'd been wrong. Spectacularly, publicly, commercially wrong. One night, months after the album's release, Gene found himself in Ace's dressing room before a show. The dynamic between them had been weird since the solo albums, a tension neither of them quite knew how to address. Ace was putting on his makeup, preparing to become Space Ace once again. Gene stood in the doorway, watching. "Your album's doing really well," Gene said. "Yeah, surprised me too," Ace replied, not looking up from the mirror. "I owe you an apology." That got Ace's attention. He turned to look at Gene. "For what?" "For underestimating you. Back when you first joined, I told you that you weren't rock star material, that you were support, not a star. I was wrong." Ace was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You weren't entirely wrong. I wasn't rock star material, not then. But I worked at it. You and Paul pushed me to be better, to develop stage presence, to become more than just a guitar player. If you hadn't pushed me, I might have stayed in my shell. But I told you that you couldn't be a star, that it wasn't in you. And then I proved you wrong, which felt pretty good, not gonna lie." Ace smiled, but there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite humor. "You know what the difference was between my album and yours?" "What?" "You tried to make what you thought would sell. I made what I wanted to make. People can tell the difference. They can hear when something's authentic versus when it's calculated. And the makeup, the character, Space Ace, all of that's great for the show. But the solo album was me without the costume, and it turned out people liked that guy too." Gene nodded slowly. "I've spent so much time trying to control everything, trying to engineer success, that I forgot success sometimes comes from just being genuine." "You're genuine too," Ace said. "Your character, the demon, that's a real part of you. The ambition, the business mind, the showmanship. That's not fake. But my solo album worked because I stopped trying to be what I thought a rock star should be and just was myself. The conversation didn't fix everything. The internal dynamics of KISS remained complicated. The power struggles between members continued. Within a few years, Ace would leave the band, frustrated by lack of creative control and feeling undervalued despite his solo album's success. But that night in the dressing room, there was a moment of genuine understanding between two very different people who'd built something massive together. Years later, in a 2014 interview, Gene Simmons was asked about his biggest mistake in KISS. His answer was surprisingly candid. "I told Ace Frehley he wasn't rock star material. I told him he was support, not a star, and then his solo album outsold mine and proved me completely wrong. I learned from that. I learned that you can't predict what will resonate with people. Ace had something genuine, something real. And the public responded to that reality in ways they didn't respond to my carefully calculated product. It was humbling and necessary." Ace, characteristically, was more modest when asked about the same period. "Gene's a smart guy, one of the smartest people I've ever met, but he's not always right. Nobody is. My solo album did well because I made music I believed in, not music I thought would sell. And maybe that's the lesson. Being a rock star isn't about having all the answers or being the smartest or most talented. It's about being willing to put yourself out there, genuinely, and see if people connect with it. Gene taught me a lot about the business, but I taught him something too, that sometimes being real is more valuable than being perfect." The story of Gene's initial dismissal of Ace and Ace's eventual vindication became part of KISS mythology, referenced in books and documentaries, used as an example of how even smart people can misjudge talent. But the deeper truth was more nuanced than simple vindication. Gene hadn't been entirely wrong when he said Ace lacked rock star qualities in 1973. The quiet, withdrawn guitarist who barely looked up from his fretboard really wasn't ready for the spotlight. But what Gene missed was that rock stars can be made, not just born. That dedication and work and genuine passion can transform someone from a talented sideman into a genuine star. Ace's solo album success didn't just prove Gene wrong. It proved that there were multiple ways to be a rock star. Gene's way was calculated showmanship, business acumen, engineered spectacle. Ace's way was genuine musicianship, authentic creativity, real connection with the audience through honest expression. Both were valid, both could succeed, and Kiss needed both to become what it became. The silver Space Ace makeup that Ace wore on stage every night was a costume, a character, a theatrical creation. But underneath that costume was a real guitarist with real talent who'd been told he wasn't good enough and had spent years proving otherwise. Not through words or arguments or demands for recognition, but through the simplest method available to any musician, making music that connected with people, that made them feel something, that resonated in ways that couldn't be engineered or predicted. Gene Simmons learned to never again tell someone they're not rock star material, because he'd learned the hard way that potential can't always be measured, that greatness sometimes comes from unexpected places, and that the quiet kid in the corner who just wants to play guitar might turn out to be the one people most want to hear from. This story is based on documented events from Kiss's early years and the 1978 solo album's era. Conversations have been dramatized while staying true to what actually happened. This narrative was created with AI assistance to bring these historical moments to life. If this story moved you, if you've ever been told you're not good enough and proved them wrong, if you've ever had someone underestimate you and use that as fuel, share this. Tell your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the moments when underdogs become legends, when support players become stars, when quiet determination speaks louder than any words.